Clara, a warm and resilient grandmother, faces the devastating loss of her husband, Henry, to a sudden heart attack. The chapter opens with Clara's memories of their 40-year marriage, filled with love, struggles, and the joy of raising their children and grandchildren. On the day of Henry's death, Clara is overwhelmed by grief, surrounded by family and friends at their modest home. However, as the evening unfolds, Henry's two brothers, Roy and Vernon, who have long harbored resentment toward Clara for perceived slights, corner her in a moment of vulnerability. Fueled by alcohol and old grudges, they verbally and physically abuse her, leaving her injured and humiliated. The assault is not described in graphic detail but conveyed through Clara's emotional and physical pain, emphasizing her shock and betrayal. Clara hides her injuries from her family, retreating into herself as she grapples with grief, shame, and fear. The chapter explores her inner turmoil, her memories of Henry as her anchor, and her struggle to maintain her role as the family's matriarch. By the end, Clara begins to confide in her lifelong friend, Mabel, hinting at the abuse but unable to fully articulate it, setting the stage for her journey toward confronting the trauma. The house was too quiet now, the kind of quiet that pressed against Clara's chest like a stone. Henry's chair sat empty by the fireplace, his reading glasses still perched on the armrest where he'd left them. She could still see him there, his broad hands flipping through the newspaper, humming some old tune from their courting days. 40 years and now he was gone just like that, a heart attack stealing him in the night. Clara stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter, her apron stained with flour from the biscuits she'd made for the wake. The mourners had come and gone, leaving casseroles and condolences, but the air still felt heavy with their pity. Clara struggles to navigate the days following Henry's death and the assault. She buries herself in routine, caring for her grandchildren, tending the garden and organizing the funeral, but the trauma lingers, manifesting in nightmares and moments of panic. Her daughters, Sarah and Ellen, notice her withdrawal but attribute it to grief. Clara's internal conflict centers on whether to reveal the abuse, fearing it will fracture the family further. Roy and Vernon continue to linger in her life, showing up unannounced, their presence a constant threat. A flashback reveals the brothers' long-standing resentment, rooted in a dispute over family land that Clara and Henry inherited. Clara begins attending a grief support group at Mabel's urging, where she meets other women who face different forms of loss and pain. One woman, Diane, shares her own story of surviving abuse, which resonates deeply with Clara. Slowly, Clara begins to find words for her experience, confiding fully in Mabel and taking tentative steps toward confronting Roy and Vernon. The chapter ends with Clara deciding to protect her family by seeking legal advice, though she's unsure if she has the strength to follow through. Clara woke with a start, her nightgown damp with sweat, the echo of Roy's voice still ringing in her ears. In the dream, Henry had been there, reaching for her, but his face had morphed into Vernon's, his hands heavy and cruel. She sat up, her breath shallow, and checked the clock. 3:17 a.m. The house was silent, save for the soft snores of her grandson Tommy in the next room. Clara pressed her hands to her face, willing the images away, but they clung like damp leaves. Morning came too soon. She moved through her routine like a ghost. Coffee brewing, eggs frying, the grandkids' chatter, a distant hum. Sarah stopped by with a stack of Henry's old shirts, her eyes red from crying. "Mama, you okay?" she asked, touching Clara's arm. Clara nodded, forcing a smile, but the bruise on her wrist, hidden under a long sleeve, throbbed at the contact. She couldn't tell Sarah. Not yet. It would break her, knowing her uncles had done this. At the grocery store, Clara's cart rattled down the aisle, her mind on the funeral arrangements. She turned a corner and froze. Roy stood there, leaning against a display of canned peaches, his grin sharp as a blade. "Look at you, Clara, out here like nothing happened," he said, low enough that no one else heard. Her heart pounded, but she straightened, clutching her purse. "Leave me be, Roy," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He chuckled and walked away, but the air felt poisoned. That evening, Mabel dragged her to the community center for a grief support group. Clara sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, as strangers shared stories of lost spouses, parents, children. Then Diane spoke, a woman with gray streaks in her hair and a quiet strength. "I lost more than my husband," she said. "I lost my sense of safety. He hurt me for years and I stayed quiet. But speaking it out loud? That's when I started to heal. Clara's throat tightened, her own truth clawing its way up. Back at Mabel's house over cups of chamomile tea, Clara broke. It was Roy and Vernon, she whispered, her voice trembling. The night Henry died, they hurt me, Mabel. Bad. Mabel's face crumpled, but she didn't interrupt, just held Clara's hand as the words spilled out, halting, raw but real. You don't have to carry this alone, Mabel said, her voice fierce. We'll figure it out together. Clara nodded, but doubt gnawed at her. Could she face them? Could she risk the family splitting apart? As she drove home, she passed the lawyer's office downtown, its sign glowing in the dusk. She didn't stop, but the idea took root, fragile but stubborn, like the first green shoot in her garden after winter. Clara takes steps toward reclaiming her life, driven by a growing sense of agency. She meets with the lawyer Karen, who helps her understand her options for pursuing charges against Roy and Vernon. The process is daunting, and Clara faces pressure from her daughters, who sense something is wrong but don't know the full story. A confrontation with Roy and Vernon at a family gathering escalates, forcing Clara to reveal the truth to Sarah and Ellen. The revelation is painful, fracturing family ties, but it also frees Clara from the burden of silence. With support from Mabel, Diane, and the grief group, Clara begins therapy, learning to process both her grief for Henry and the trauma of the assault. The chapter culminates in Clara testifying in court, a moment of empowerment that doesn't erase the pain but marks a new beginning. The story ends with Clara in her garden, planting flowers with her grandchildren, symbolizing her healing and hope for the future. Clara sat in the lawyer's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. Karen, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense voice, leaned forward. What you went through, Clara, it's not just wrong, it's a crime. You have every right to pursue this. Clara nodded, but her stomach churned. Telling Mabel had been hard enough. Telling a stranger felt like peeling back her skin. But Karen's steady gaze held no judgment, only resolve, and Clara felt a flicker of courage. I just want them to know they can't hurt me anymore, she said softly. The family barbecue was a mistake. Clara had hoped to keep things normal for the grandkids, but Roy and Vernon showed up uninvited, their laughter grating against her nerves. When Roy made a snide comment about Henry's will, Clara's temper snapped. Enough, she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. The backyard went quiet, all eyes on her. You hurt me, she said, looking straight at them. The night Henry died, you hurt me, and I won't let you pretend it didn't happen. Sarah gasped, Ellen's face paled, and the truth hung heavy in the air. Roy tried to laugh it off, but Clara's stare silenced him. Later, in the kitchen, Sarah and Ellen held her as she cried, their anger and love a balm to her wounds. Therapy was harder than Clara expected. The counselor, Dr. Ellis, asked questions that made her squirm, but she kept going week after week, learning to name the pain without letting it define her. The courtroom was worse, a sterile room, Roy and Vernon sitting smugly across from her. But when Clara took the stand, her voice didn't waver. They took something from me, she said, but they don't get to take my strength. The judge's ruling, restraining orders, community service, felt small compared to the weight of speaking her truth. Months later, Clara knelt in her garden, the earth cool under her fingers. Tommy and Lila, her grandkids, giggled as they planted marigolds, their small hands patting the soil. The sun was warm, the air sweet with spring. Clara thought of Henry, his smile, his love, and felt him there, in the breeze, in the laughter. She'd lost so much, but she'd found something too. A voice, a strength, a new dawn. As Lila handed her a seedling, Clara smiled. Let's make it grow, she said, and for the first time in months she believed she could. Clara sat in the waiting room of Karen Thompson's law office, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the faint hum of the air conditioner doing little to ease the knot in her stomach. The room smelled of coffee and old books, and the walls were lined with framed certificates that spoke of Karen's expertise. Clara's eyes lingered on a small potted plant on the receptionist's desk, its leaves curling slightly at the edges, as if it too was weary from the weight of the world. She adjusted her shawl, making sure it covered the fading bruise on her wrist, a reminder of that terrible night, now weeks past, when Roy and Vernon had shattered her sense of safety. Karen emerged from her office, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her smile warm but professional. Clara, come on in, she said. gesturing to a chair across from her desk. Clara rose, her knees stiff from sitting too long, and followed. The office was small but tidy, with a window overlooking the town square, where children played near the fountain and shopkeepers swept their storefronts. It was a normal day in their small rural town, but for Clara, nothing felt normal anymore. "I've been thinking about what you said," Clara began, her voice low, almost swallowed by the creak of the chair as she Saturday about pressing charges. "I don't know if I can do it." Her fingers twisted the hem of her shawl, the soft fabric grounding her as her thoughts spun. Telling Mabel had been one thing. Her oldest friend had held her hand and cried with her, promising to stand by her side. But this was different. This was putting her pain on display, letting the world see the ugliness she carried in silence. Karen leaned forward, her eyes steady. "Clara, what happened to you was a crime. Not just a betrayal, not just a family matter, a crime. You have every right to seek justice. But I won't lie, it's not an easy road. There'll be questions, maybe a hearing. Roy and Vernon will have to face what they did, and you'll have to tell your story. But you won't be alone. I'll be with you, and so will anyone else you want by your side." Clara nodded, but her throat tightened. She thought of Sarah and Ellen, her daughters, who still didn't know the full truth. She thought of her grandchildren, Tommy and Lila, whose laughter had been her lifeline these past weeks. What would it do to them, learning their uncles had hurt her? Would it tear the family apart, like ripping a seam that could never be mended? "I just want them to know they can't hurt me anymore," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to feel safe again." Karen's expression softened, but her voice held a quiet strength. "That's a good place to start. Let's talk through your options, restraining orders, assault charges, or even just a formal complaint to get it on record. You don't have to decide today, but knowing what's possible might help." They spent the next hour discussing the process, Karen's words clear and measured, breaking down the legal steps like a map Clara could follow. A restraining order would keep Roy and Vernon away from her home, her garden, the places she held dear. Charges could lead to a trial, though Karen warned that proving assault without witnesses might be challenging. "Your testimony will carry weight," she said. "Your truth matters." Clara clung to those words, turning them over in her mind as she drove home, the lawyer's card tucked in her purse like a talisman. The family barbecue was meant to be a small gathering, a chance to honor Henry's memory with food and stories, the way he'd always loved. Clara had hesitated to host it, but Sarah had insisted. "We need this, Mama," she'd said, her eyes bright with the kind of hope Clara hadn't felt in weeks. "For the kids. For us." So Clara had agreed, spending the morning chopping vegetables and marinating chicken, her hands moving on instinct while her mind churned with unease. Roy and Vernon hadn't been invited, but in a small town, family events had a way of pulling everyone in like moths to a flame. The backyard was alive with noise. Tommy and Lila chasing each other through the grass, Sarah's husband flipping burgers on the grill, Ellen setting out plates with her usual efficiency. Clara stood by the picnic table, arranging a bowl of potato salad, when she heard the familiar rumble of Vernon's truck pulling into the drive. Her stomach dropped, but she forced herself to breathe, to keep her hands steady. "They won't touch me here," she told herself. "Not with everyone around." But Roy's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "Well, look at this spread," he said, striding into the yard with Vernon trailing behind, a beer already in his hand. "Clara, you always did know how to play the perfect hostess." His tone was light, but his eyes held that same sharpness she'd seen that night, the one that made her skin crawl. She ignored him, focusing on the napkins she was stacking, but her hands shook. Sarah noticed, her brow furrowing. "Mama, you okay?" she asked, stepping closer. Clara nodded, but the lie felt heavy on her tongue. She wanted to tell Sarah everything, to let the truth spill out and cleanse the air, but the words wouldn't come. Not here, not now. The afternoon wore on, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the yard. Clara stayed busy refilling drinks, wiping Tommy's face, anything to keep moving. But Roy wouldn't let her be. He cornered her near the garden shed, his voice low and mocking. "You think you're above us, don't you? Always have. Henry's gone, and you're still acting like you own the place." He gestured vaguely toward the house, the land, the life Clara and Henry had built. The old grudge over the family land they'd inherited years ago still festered, and Clara realized it had always been about more than the acres. It was about her strength, her happiness with Henry, everything they resented. "Enough," Clara said, her voice sharp, cutting through the hum of the party. The yard went quiet, heads turning, the clatter of plates and laughter fading. She faced Roy, her heart pounding but her resolve like steel. "You hurt me," she said, her voice steady now, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The night Henry died, you and Vernon hurt me. You made me bleed. And I won't let you pretend it didn't happen." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ellen froze, a plate slipping from her fingers to the grass. Vernon shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting away, but Roy tried to laugh, a harsh, hollow sound. "You're losing it, Clara," he said. "Grief's got you making things up." But Clara didn't flinch. "I'm not the one lying," she said, her gaze locked on his. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sarah stepped forward, her face pale but fierce. "Mama, what are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. Clara reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly, and the truth poured out. Not the details, not the ugliness, but enough. Enough for her daughters to know, to understand, to stand with her. The confrontation ended with Roy and Vernon leaving, their truck kicking up dust as they sped away. Sarah and Ellen stayed close, their arms around Clara as she cried, their anger and love a shield against the pain. "We'll make this right, Mama," Ellen whispered, her voice fierce. "They won't get away with it." The weeks that followed were a blur of small, painful steps. Clara met with Karen again, deciding to pursue a restraining order and file assault charges. The process was daunting: paperwork, statements, the looming possibility of a hearing. She worried about the town's reaction, the whispers that might follow her to the grocery store or church. But Mabel was there, bringing casseroles and fierce encouragement, and Diane from the grief group called regularly, her own story of survival a beacon for Clara. Therapy was harder than Clara had expected. Dr. Ellis, a soft-spoken woman with a knack for asking questions that cut deep, pushed Clara to name her feelings: fear, shame, anger, grief. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," Dr. Ellis said during one session, her voice gentle but firm. "What would it feel like to let some of that weight go?" Clara didn't have an answer at first, but she kept going week after week, learning to untangle the knot of pain inside her. She spoke of Henry, of the love they'd shared, and how his absence felt like a hole in the world. She spoke of the assault, haltingly at first, then with more clarity, each word a step toward reclaiming her voice. The courtroom was the hardest part. It was a small room, sterile and cold, with rows of wooden benches and a judge who looked tired but attentive. Roy and Vernon sat across from her, their faces unreadable, their lawyer whispering in their ears. Clara's hands trembled as she took the stand, but she thought of Henry, of his quiet strength, and found her own. "They took something from me," she said, her voice clear despite the tightness in her chest. "That night they hurt me, physically and in my heart. But they don't get to take my strength. Not anymore." Her testimony was brief, but it felt like a lifetime. Karen had prepared her for the questions, the doubts, the way Roy's lawyer might try to twist her words. But Clara held firm, her truth a steady anchor. The judge's ruling came quickly: a restraining order for both brothers, community service for the assault, and a formal acknowledgement of their actions. It wasn't the harsh punishment Clara might have imagined in her angriest moments, but it was enough. It was a line drawn, a boundary set, a declaration that she mattered. Spring came slowly to the town, the air warming, the fields bursting with green. Clara knelt in her garden, the earth cool and soft under her fingers. Tommy and Lila were with her, their small hands digging holes for marigold seedlings, their laughter bright against the morning quiet. "Look, Grandma," Lila said, holding up a worm, her face lit with delight. Clara smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She thought of Henry, his broad hands working this same soil, his voice humming as he planted tomatoes or pruned the roses. She thought of the night he died, the pain that followed, and the long road she'd walked since. The bruises had faded, but the scars, inside and out, would always be there. Yet they didn't define her. Not anymore. Mabel stopped by later, bringing a pitcher of iced tea and a basket of muffins. They sat on the porch watching the kids play, and Clara felt a peace she hadn't known in months. You did it, Clara, Mabel said, her voice soft. You stood up and you're still standing. Clara nodded, her eyes on the horizon where the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. I'm still here, she said, and the words felt like a promise. To Henry, to her family, to herself. She thought of the marigolds, their bright petals pushing through the earth, and knew she could do the same. She could grow, she could heal, she could rise. She hadn't cried yet. Not really. There'd been a few tears in the hospital, when the doctor's words had blurred into static, but since then Clara had held it together. For her daughters, for the grandkids, for the neighbors who needed her to be strong. That's who she was, Clara, the one who fixed things, who made lemonade from life's sour fruit. But tonight her hands trembled as she washed the dishes, the clink of plates drowning out the ache in her heart. The back door creaked open and Clara tensed. Roy and Vernon stumbled in, their faces flushed from whiskey, their eyes sharp with something she couldn't place. Henry's brothers had always been rough around the edges, but they'd never crossed her like this before. Clara, Roy slurred, his voice thick with venom. You think you're better than us, don't you? Always did. She turned, forcing a smile. Roy, it's been a long day. Let's not. Don't tell me what to do, he snapped, stepping closer. Vernon lingered behind, his silence louder than Roy's words. Clara's heart thudded, but she stood her ground, her hands still wet from the sink. She thought of Henry, how he'd always stepped between her and their tempers. But Henry wasn't here now. What happened next was a blur. A shove, a raised voice, a hand gripping her arm too tight. Clara stumbled, her hip hitting the counter, pain flaring as she fell to her knees. Words cut deeper than the blows. Accusations, old grudges, things she didn't understand. She tasted blood, felt the warmth of it on her lip, but worse was the shame, hot and heavy, as they laughed and left her there. Clara pulled herself up, her breath ragged. She cleaned her face, hid the bruises under her shawl, and went back to the dishes. The grandkids were asleep upstairs. Her daughters were in the living room, sorting through Henry's things. No one could know. Not yet. Later, when Mabel came by with a thermos of tea, Clara almost told her. They sat on the porch, the night thick with summer heat. Clara, you don't look right, Mabel said, her eyes searching. Clara opened her mouth, but the words caught, heavy as the stone in her chest. Just tired, she whispered. But Mabel's hand on hers felt like a lifeline, and Clara wondered if she could ever let the truth spill free.